Welcome back, dreamers. I hope you're set up to hear more disturbing tales. Before you drift to sleep, tell me in the comments from where you're listening from. If you want to hear more stories, make sure to subscribe to enjoy more videos. During my sophomore year of high school, I had a significant crush on a guy who was a couple of years older than me. He was a standout player on the boys' basketball team, known for his skill on the court and his easygoing charm. We shared a connection through basketball. I was on the girls' team, and we'd occasionally chat during practice overlaps or in the hallways between classes. I often tried to get him to join me for a pickup game at our town's outdoor basketball court, a popular spot where students gathered during warmer months. He usually smiled and politely declined, citing homework or prior commitments. One cold winter evening, completely out of the blue, he sent me a message asking if I wanted to play a game of one-on-one. It was unusual for several reasons. We rarely talked outside of school. It was the middle of winter, and playing basketball outdoors at night wasn't exactly common in our small town. The court had no lights, and temperatures were well below freezing. Despite the odd timing, I was excited about the opportunity to spend time with him and didn't want to pass it up. To ease my parents' concerns and for my own comfort, I invited my close friend to come along. She agreed, and we bundled up in layers, thermal shirts, hoodies, jackets, gloves, and hats to brace against the cold. The streets were quiet as we walked to the court, our breath visible in the icy air. Snow from a recent flurry crunched under our boots, and the glow from the streetlights reflected off the white blanket covering the ground. When we arrived, he was already there, casually dribbling a basketball near one of the hoops. The court was deserted, except for us, surrounded by bare trees that rustled softly in the light wind. He greeted us with a warm smile and a friendly wave. I felt a mix of nervousness and excitement as we approached. We started playing, and the game was light-hearted and fun. Laughter echoed in the crisp night as we took shots and playfully teased each other about missed baskets. The cold seemed less biting with the activity and his engaging conversation. He was more talkative than usual, asking about my interests outside of basketball and sharing stories from his own experiences on the team. My friend cheered us on from the sidelines, occasionally chiming in with jokes. After a while, my friend began to show signs of boredom and discomfort from the cold. She pulled me aside and mentioned that she was thinking of heading back home. Before I could respond, he joined the conversation and assured her that he would give me a ride back to her house when we were done. He seemed sincere, and since we all lived in the same general area, it didn't strike us as a problem. I felt a flutter of anticipation at the thought of spending some time alone with him. She agreed and left us to continue our game. As she walked away, I noticed the streets were even emptier than before, the quietness of the night settling in. We resumed playing, but the dynamic subtly shifted. He became more competitive, and his comments turned into light teasing about my basketball skills. I brushed it off, attributing it to playful banter. After about half an hour, the cold started to seep through my layers, and my fingers felt numb even inside my gloves. I suggested that we wrap up and head back. He agreed, mentioning that it was getting late. We walked to his car, which was parked under a dim streetlight a short distance away. The car was an older model, and as we approached, he apologized for the mess inside, quickly tossing some items into the back seat to make room. We settled into the car, and he started the engine. The heater sputtered to life, but didn't provide much warmth immediately. He commented that it might take a few minutes for the car to warm up, and I nodded, grateful for any relief from the biting cold. There was a brief silence as he fiddled with his phone, scrolling through messages or music selections. I couldn't tell which. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the faint music playing softly from the radio. I tried to make conversation, mentioning how quiet the town seemed at night and thanking him again for inviting me out. He smiled but didn't say much, his attention focused on his phone. The atmosphere in the car felt different, slightly tense but not overtly uncomfortable. I assumed he might be tired or preoccupied and didn't think too much of it. After about 10 minutes, I noticed that we were still parked, and the car was beginning to warm up. I mentioned that my friend might be expecting me and suggested we head out. He agreed and put the car into gear. As we pulled away from the curb, I expected him to take the usual route back to my friend's house. However, he turned in the opposite direction. Surprised, I pointed out that the turn led away from where we needed to go. He glanced over and said he wanted to take a quick drive to show me something interesting. He assured me it wouldn't take long and that we'd be back soon. I felt a slight unease, but didn't want to seem rude or unappreciative. After all, he was going out of his way to spend time with me, and maybe he had planned a surprise or something special. We drove through the quiet streets of our town, passing darkened storefronts and empty sidewalks. The familiar scenery began to fade as he steered the car toward the outskirts of town. Street lights became sparse, and the houses were set farther apart. I commented on how different the area looked at night, trying to keep the conversation light. He responded with short answers, his focus on the road ahead. The farther we went, the more isolated the surroundings became. Snow-covered fields stretched out on either side, and the road narrowed as we transitioned from paved streets to a gravel path. The crunching sound of tires on gravel filled the car. I felt a growing sense of uncertainty and checked my phone instinctively, only to remember that I had left it charging at my friend's house. I asked again where we were going, mentioning that it was getting late. He smiled and said he thought I would appreciate the place he was taking me to, repeating that we'd be back soon. The lack of specifics made me uneasy. The initial excitement of the evening was fading, replaced by a nagging concern that something wasn't right. As we continued down the gravel road, the car's headlights illuminated a small structure in the distance. It looked like an old, abandoned shack, barely visible against the dark backdrop of trees. My unease grew stronger, and I considered asking him to turn around. Before I could say anything, he slowed the car and pulled over near the shack. He turned off the engine and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The friendly demeanor he had earlier seemed to have shifted. My instincts told me that this was not where I wanted to be, and I needed to find a way back. As the car slowed to a stop near the shack, the sound of the gravel crunching beneath the tires seemed amplified in the otherwise silent night. The distant hum of the engine cut off, leaving an eerie quietness that made the isolation feel even more pronounced. The old structure ahead looked even more ominous up close, its wooden panels weathered and warped from years of exposure, with a faint outline of what might have been a door barely visible under the car's dim headlights. I asked where we were and why he had brought me here. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, but my hands were clammy as they rested in my lap. He didn't answer my question directly. Instead, he leaned back in his seat and started talking about meeting some people inside. The casual tone in his voice clashed with the bizarre nature of what he was saying, making it even more unsettling. He glanced at me with a strange expression, something that might have been amusement but felt completely out of place given the circumstances. Then he began speaking in a way that felt rehearsed, as though he had been waiting for an opportunity to say these things. He mentioned how he thought I seemed like the type who would fit in with the group he was meeting, and he hinted at ideas that were disturbingly suggestive. His words were deliberately vague, but carried an undertone that made my stomach churn. He mentioned that I might like what they had planned, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place but instinctively wanted to get away from. As he spoke, he gestured toward the shack, suggesting that it was only a short walk and that I should come with him. My heart began to pound harder as I realized how far from safety I was. The town was miles away, and the isolation of the place made the situation feel more dangerous with every passing second. I tried to mask my panic, replying lightly that it was late and that my friend was probably waiting for me to return. When I casually mentioned heading back, he chuckled softly, a sound that felt completely out of sync with the growing tension in the air. He didn't immediately start the car. Instead, he kept talking. This time, his words grew darker. He began to describe with unsettling calmness how he got a sense of satisfaction from controlling situations and people. His voice was calm but unwavering, as though he genuinely believed everything he was saying. He said things about wanting to see people pushed beyond their limits, and how he found it fascinating to watch their reactions. The casual tone of his words only made them more chilling, as though he didn't see anything wrong with the direction the conversation was heading. My instincts screamed at me to stay calm, not to reveal the fear bubbling under the surface. I asked a few questions in return, trying to keep the focus on his monologue rather than my growing discomfort. Inside, I was frantically scanning the situation for options, realizing just how trapped I was. The shack loomed in the background as he talked, its shadow almost swallowing the small clearing in darkness. Every passing second felt like an eternity, and I became acutely aware of my lack of resources. No phone, no way to call for help, and no one around to hear if I screamed. As he leaned slightly toward me, still talking in that low, unsettling tone, I finally spotted his phone resting in the console between us. It was my one chance. Carefully, I reached out and slid my hand toward the phone, trying to appear casual. I asked a question to distract him, my voice strained but steady. He glanced up briefly, seemingly caught off guard by the shift in conversation. It was just enough time for me to grab his phone and pull it into my lap. I held it tightly, my thumb instinctively finding the home button. At that moment, I felt the weight of every decision I'd made leading up to this night. The tension in the car was thick, the kind of silence that made every sound outside seem louder. I was determined not to let him see how much his words had rattled me, but my pulse was racing, and my grip on the phone felt almost too tight. The car sat there for another agonizing moment before I finally spoke. With as much calm as I could muster, I told him I had dialed 911 and was ready to press call unless he turned the car around immediately. The words came out with more strength than I thought I had in me, but my hands trembled as I clutched the phone. His reaction was both unnerving and bizarre. He stared at me for a moment, then broke into laughter. As he laughed, his tone shifted from amusement to something unnervingly casual, almost as if trying to convince me that everything had been a joke. "Relax," he said, his words dripping with insincerity. "I was just messing with you." His hands tightened around the steering wheel, and for a moment, I thought he might double down on his act. But then his shoulders sagged slightly, and he muttered something about heading back. The car jerked into reverse, and gravel crunched loudly under the tires as he backed out of the clearing. The drive back to my friend's house was agonizingly slow. The tension in the car was suffocating, and the sound of the tires on the pavement seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. He made a few attempts to restart a conversation, his voice overly light as though trying to pretend the last half hour hadn't happened. I responded in clipped, one-word answers, my focus entirely on the road and my growing sense of relief as we approached the familiar streets of town. Even though I still held his phone in my lap with 911 dialed and ready to go, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still trying to gauge my reaction, waiting for a crack in my composure. At every stop sign and turn, I mentally calculated how far I would have to run if he tried anything else. When he finally pulled into the driveway of my friend's house, the sense of safety was almost overwhelming, but I wasn't about to let my guard down yet. I opened the car door quickly, stepping out while keeping his phone in my hand as I edged toward the house. His window rolled down, and he leaned out slightly, his face unreadable in the dim light. "I'd really appreciate it if you didn't tell anyone about tonight," he said, his voice devoid of the humor from earlier. His eyes were locked on mine, and there was something almost pleading about his tone, though it didn't make me feel any less uneasy. I didn't answer. Instead, I handed him back his phone, careful to avoid touching his hand, and turned to walk up the driveway. I didn't look back, but I heard the screech of his tires as he sped off, leaving a trail of dust in the cold night air. My legs felt like jelly as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Once I was safely in my friend's house, the adrenaline that had been keeping me going finally started to wear off. My hands were still trembling as I recounted the night to her, glossing over the more disturbing parts because I didn't want to scare her. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my head. Every time I walked down a quiet street or got into someone's car, I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach. I never saw him again, and I avoided the basketball courts entirely after that night. Looking back, I'm still haunted by the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't grabbed his phone, or if I had agreed to step out of the car at that shack in the middle of nowhere. Even now, the memory lingers like a shadow, a chilling reminder of how quickly a seemingly ordinary situation can spiral into something dangerous. When my family moved into the house, there was a sense of accomplishment that came with it. We had spent years scrimping and saving, so finally having this spacious, upscale home felt like a reward for all the sacrifices. It was the kind of place you'd see in a magazine, with perfectly trimmed hedges and a pristine driveway. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the struggles of the past. The house had some quirks, though, particularly the loft. Positioned right at the center of the second floor, it was a standout feature. It connected both the front and back staircases, giving it a sort of commanding view over the rest of the house. At first glance, it seemed like the perfect spot to hang out. It was open, airy, and bathed in natural light during the day. But the openness also made it strangely exposed. Sitting in the loft, you couldn't shake the feeling that you were on display, visible from every corner of the house. Evenings in the loft were different. Without sunlight streaming through the windows, the atmosphere would shift. The shadows from the staircases seemed to stretch and loom, making the space feel much larger than it actually was. Every creak of the house settling was amplified by the loft's acoustics, echoing faintly like someone was walking just out of sight. It was the kind of unease you try to brush off as irrational. It's just a new place, I'd tell myself, but that uneasy feeling clung to the back of my mind. Despite that, the loft quickly became a regular hangout spot for me and my two best friends. We'd sprawl out on the couch, flipping through TV channels or tossing around ideas for what to do that weekend. They were always welcome at my house. My parents liked them, and the loft was a perfect spot to chill without interruption. On this particular day, we were doing just that, lounging around and half watching some random show. It felt routine and normal. The house itself was quiet, save for the faint hum of the television. My parents were out running errands, leaving us to enjoy the place to ourselves. As my friends playfully bickered over what to watch next, I started to notice the stillness in the air. Not the kind of calm you feel in a peaceful home, but the type that felt heavier, like the air carried weight. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make me glance around the room, checking for something, anything, out of place. The loft's layout only added to the weird sensation. With two staircases leading up to it, there was always the chance someone could come up behind you without you noticing right away. The thought would pop into my head sometimes as we sat there, but I'd shrug it off. I told myself it was just the newness of the house playing tricks on me. Still, every once in a while, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. Of course, no one ever was. That loft was a mix of comfort and unease, a strange contradiction. It was where I felt most at home with my friends, yet it was also where I felt the most vulnerable. Even in those early days, before I fully understood why, the space had a way of keeping me on edge. Looking back, I wonder if that unease was my subconscious trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. That particular day started out like any other hangout session in the loft. The three of us, me and my two best friends, were settled into the couch, half watching TV while they flirted and joked with each other. They'd been a couple for a while, and though their constant PDA could get annoying, I'd gotten used to it. The loft felt like our spot, open and bright, and it was one of the few places where we could hang out without parents hovering nearby. After a while, I got up to use the bathroom. The second I stepped out of the loft, I could hear them giggling behind me, and I rolled my eyes. I figured they'd take advantage of me leaving to get a little closer, but I didn't care much. It was typical for them. The hallway leading to the bathroom felt a little colder than usual, but I brushed it off. The air conditioning in the house sometimes created drafts, especially near the staircases. When I returned a few minutes later, I was surprised to find them sitting at opposite ends of the couch. Their body language was stiff, and the air in the room felt different. It wasn't just awkward, it was tense, like something had shifted in the few moments I'd been gone. I asked them what was up, jokingly, to try and lighten the mood, but they didn't laugh. Instead, the guy, looking visibly uneasy, pointed toward the staircase. "Your little sister is home," he said matter-of-factly. The words didn't make sense to me. I knew my sister wasn't home. She was staying at a friend's house for the day. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. He and his girlfriend exchanged glances, both looking genuinely rattled. "She was here," the girl said, her voice quieter. "We heard her laughing and running up the stairs. She sounded like she was playing around or something." My heart started to race. The stairs leading to the loft weren't carpeted. They were hardwood, and any movement on them echoed loudly. If they'd heard something, I would have heard it too on my way back from the bathroom. But I hadn't. The house had been silent. I forced myself to stay calm as I explained, "No one's home. My sister's not even here today." They both just stared at me, their expressions turning from confusion to something closer to fear. I could tell they were trying to rationalize it, but the tension in the room was thick. My mind raced with possibilities. Could someone have gotten into the house without us noticing? I hadn't heard the door open or close, and I knew the locks were secure. To ease the tension, I suggested we check the house, though deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to. We walked carefully down the front staircase, staying close together, the creaks of the wood louder than usual. I led the way, turning on every light as we moved through the house. Room by room, we checked, our footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent space. Each room we entered was exactly as we'd left it. No one was there. No signs of anyone coming or going. The house felt eerily still, like the calm after a storm. My friends didn't say much as we finished checking and made our way back to the loft. Their earlier confidence had faded, and I could tell they were just as unsettled as I was, if not more. Whatever they thought they'd heard, it wasn't something they could easily brush off, and neither could I. Even after we settled back into the loft, the atmosphere had changed. Playful banter was gone, replaced by a cautious silence. Every creak of the house, every distant noise, made us jump. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all waiting, listening for whatever might happen next. As unsettling as that day in the loft had been, what followed in the months afterward was even harder to explain. It started with the intercom system, something I had barely thought about before. The house was equipped with a central intercom that connected every room, allowing music or announcements to play through the speakers. Most of the time, it just sat there unused, a relic of the house's model home days. The first time it happened, I was jolted awake by the sound of static. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like someone holding down the talk button but saying nothing. It took me a moment to realize what it was because the intercom system hadn't been touched in years. Groggy and confused, I stumbled out of bed and made my way downstairs to the main unit, which controlled the entire system. The sound grew louder as I approached, the static filling the hallway with a strange, oppressive hum. When I got to the unit, the talk button was pressed down, but no one was there. The button itself didn't appear stuck. It was as if someone had intentionally held it down. I released it, and the static stopped immediately. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, listening to the silence of the house. Convinced it was just a weird malfunction, I went back to bed, trying to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. But it didn't stop. The intercom would turn on at random times, always late at night. Sometimes it was static. Other times it was faint sounds, unintelligible murmurs, like someone trying to talk but unable to form words. I would walk through the house, checking each room, and every time I'd find the same thing. The talk button pressed down, the source of the noise. It happened often enough that I developed a routine. I'd hear the noise, sigh in frustration, go downstairs, and turn it off without even thinking much about it. But then came the night I saw the light. It was around 2 a.m., and I was jolted awake not by the static, but by a faint glow coming from the intercom unit in the hallway. The soft green light of the talk indicator was flickering, as if someone was tapping it repeatedly. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. Something about seeing the light flicker instead of hearing the static made it feel more intentional. I crept down the stairs, every step creaking under my weight. The air in the house felt heavy, like I was being watched. When I reached the unit, the flickering stopped, and the light returned to its normal steady glow. The talk button was pressed down again. My hands shook as I released it, and for a moment I just stood there, staring at the intercom. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After that night, I started to dread the intercom. I unplugged it once, hoping to stop the disturbances altogether, but the next morning it was plugged back in. I asked my family if they had done it, but no one ever claimed responsibility. Sharing a room with my brother brought its own set of quirks, but none were as persistent as our bedroom door. It had a habit of popping open on its own, always catching us off guard. The door wasn't broken exactly, but the latch didn't quite line up unless you closed it in a specific way. Over time, we figured out that you had to press it firmly, then pull slightly until you heard a faint click. If you didn't do it just right, it was like inviting the door to creak open at the most inconvenient moments. When we were younger, the sound of the door swinging open in the dark was enough to scare us into staying awake, imagining all sorts of sinister reasons behind it. Every little noise that followed, the gentle creak of the hinges, the faint sound of the latch scraping, played tricks on our minds. As we got older, the fear turned into annoyance. It wasn't the mystery that unsettled us anymore, but the way it disrupted our sleep or made the room feel exposed. Even so, we never stopped making sure the door was properly closed each night. It became part of our bedtime ritual, like brushing our teeth or setting our alarms. On this particular night, though, things were different. My brother and I had spent the evening watching TV, something we often did to wind down before bed. The show wasn't anything remarkable, just one of those reruns we had seen a dozen times before, but it was comforting background noise. We had snacks scattered around, the kind of junk food that always made its way into our late-night hangouts, and the faint hum of the TV filled the room. By the time the credits rolled on the last episode, we were both barely keeping our eyes open. The door, as usual, hadn't been closed properly. It wasn't that we forgot. It was more that we were too tired to care. My brother muttered something about fixing it in the morning, and I agreed, pulling the blanket over me as I sank into the mattress. The room felt unusually quiet once the TV was off, and even though I was drifting off, I noticed the faint sounds from outside, maybe a dog barking in the distance or the hum of a car passing by. It was one of those moments where everything felt still, the kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of your surroundings. I remember thinking, just before sleep took over, that we'd probably regret not closing the door properly. It was almost a guarantee that it would creak open in the middle of the night, but exhaustion won out. My brother was already snoring lightly, and I figured if the door did its usual trick, it wouldn't bother me enough to get out of bed. I had no idea how different the night would turn out to be. As I lay frozen, my eyes remained locked on the figure near the window. Every small detail in the room seemed amplified in that moment. The faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the subtle creak of the floorboards as the figure shifted its weight ever so slightly. The air felt thick, like the kind of humidity you'd feel before a thunderstorm, making it hard to breathe. My focus darted back and forth, from the shadowy figure to my brother, whose soft snores continued unbroken, completely unaware of the unsettling presence just feet away. I tried to calm myself, reasoning through every possible explanation. Maybe my brother had left something hanging on the window earlier, or maybe it was a trick of the moonlight casting a distorted shadow through the curtains. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't hold. The way it moved earlier, deliberate and fluid, was unmistakable. This was no illusion, no misplaced jacket. Someone or something was in the room. Every second dragged on like an eternity. I became acutely aware of my own body, the shallow rise and fall of my chest as I struggled to breathe without making a sound. My hands twitched slightly, desperate to move, to grab something, anything, to defend myself. But it was as if I were locked in place by some unseen force. The sensation of paralysis was overwhelming. not just physical but mental, as if my mind refused to fully accept the reality of what was happening. The figure didn't move much, but its presence was impossibly heavy, filling every corner of the room. Its head tilted slightly, as though it was observing something beyond the window, but I couldn't see what. My eyes darted to the curtains, their edges fluttering faintly in the night breeze. It felt like the air around the figure was alive, vibrating faintly, though I couldn't hear anything beyond the blood pounding in my ears. I strained to hear something, anything, but the silence was absolute, save for the occasional creak of the house settling. I thought about the dogs downstairs. Normally their barking at the slightest noise was a source of frustration, but now I longed for it. The absence of their alarm felt deafening, as if they too were gripped by the same oppressive stillness. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was in the room didn't want to be heard. It wasn't just the figure's presence that was disturbing, it was the deliberate quiet that followed it, like the house itself was complicit in its intrusion. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. My muscles ached from remaining so tense, but I couldn't relax, couldn't even close my eyes. I felt a growing urge to scream, to shake my brother awake, but fear held me in check. If I made a sound, would it turn toward me? Would it come closer? These thoughts raced through my head, each one more terrifying than the last, as I stared at the unmoving shadow near the window. Finally, exhaustion began to creep in. My vision blurred slightly, and the tension in my body started to give way. I didn't want to fall asleep. I needed to stay alert, but my body was betraying me. The figure remained by the window, unmoving yet unbearably present, as I reluctantly drifted into an uneasy sleep. That evening, the weight of what my sister had said earlier stayed with me, hanging heavy in the air. I found myself replaying her words over and over, dissecting the moment when she described seeing me, or who she thought was me, standing in her room by the window. It wasn't just what she said, but the conviction in her voice. She wasn't questioning what she saw. She was telling me, plainly, as if it were a fact. I tried to go about my evening routine, hoping normalcy would help shake off the unease. I scrolled through my phone, played some music, and even helped clean up the kitchen after dinner, but my mind kept drifting back. When I finally sat down in the living room with my sister later, I carefully steered the conversation away from the previous night, focusing on lighter, unrelated topics. But every so often, I'd catch myself glancing at her, wondering if she felt the same quiet tension that had taken hold of me. When it was time to head back to my room, I hesitated at the doorway. Normally, it wouldn't have been something I thought twice about. Just another night in a house we'd lived in for years. But that night, the door seemed heavier, the room darker, and the memory of the figure by the window sharper. I forced myself to step inside, turning on the bedside lamp as quickly as I could. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours, unable to shake the thought that someone, had been in my room the night before. What unsettled me even more was the idea that whatever it was had made its way to my sister's room after I saw it. The connection between the two incidents gnawed at me. Could it really be possible that two people experienced the same thing in different rooms at the same time? The idea seemed implausible, but then again, I couldn't deny how her description matched exactly what I'd witnessed. The room felt unusually still, like the kind of quiet that makes every small sound seem amplified. The creaks of the house settling and the occasional noise of the wind outside suddenly felt sharper and more intrusive, making me hyper-aware of my surroundings. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to creak open or for something to appear on the other side. Eventually, I drifted off into a restless sleep, but my dreams were filled with fragmented images of shadows and a figure by the window. I woke up several times throughout the night, each time with a sense of unease and the lingering thought that something unseen was watching. Even though I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, I couldn't shake the feeling that the events of that night were part of something bigger, something I couldn't explain. It started out as an ordinary moment, just me at a gas station, doing something as mundane as adding air to my tires. It was the kind of task that didn't require much thought, something I'd done dozens of times before. The station wasn't particularly busy, with only a couple of other cars parked farther away near the gas pumps. The day was quiet, and I was absorbed in what I was doing, not paying much attention to my surroundings. That's when I first noticed him walking over. At first, he seemed like just another passerby, maybe someone killing time while waiting for his car to fill up. He greeted me casually, commenting on something innocuous, like how chilly it had gotten for that time of year. I responded politely, but kept my attention on the tire gauge, hoping he'd move along. Instead, he stayed, launching into more small talk about cars and asking if I came to this station often. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it felt overly familiar for someone I didn't know. I tried to keep the interaction polite yet distant, not wanting to escalate anything, but his presence began to feel suffocating. He inched closer with every sentence, eventually leaning on the hood of my car as if staking his claim to the space. My gut instinct told me something was wrong, though I couldn't point to any one specific thing he said or did. It was more the way he lingered, the way his eyes seemed to dart around, not nervously but calculatingly. He kept glancing toward the gas pumps and the station's convenience store, as if checking who else was there or waiting for the area to empty out. I began to take stock of my surroundings in a way I hadn't before. There were no attendants visible, no other customers within shouting distance. The few cars at the pumps looked like they belonged to people busy inside the store. My car was parked at an awkward angle near the air pump, slightly away from the main flow of traffic, which now felt like a huge mistake. I started to realize how exposed I was. The worst part was realizing I'd left my keys inside the car. It was such a careless habit, something I did without thinking because I trusted the world around me. Now that trust felt like a glaring vulnerability. My phone wasn't in my pocket either. It was zipped inside my bag, which was sitting on the passenger seat, completely out of reach. All I had were the clothes on my back and a tire gauge in my hand, which felt laughably inadequate as a defense. He kept talking, his voice steady and casual, but his body language felt off. He had positioned himself in a way that made it impossible for me to easily step around him and get into my car. Every time I shifted slightly, he adjusted, as if to subtly block me. It wasn't overtly threatening, but the intent behind his movements felt unmistakable. I could feel my heart pounding harder with each passing second. I tried to think of ways to end the conversation without making him suspicious. Could I make an excuse and walk toward the convenience store? But then I'd be leaving my car and my keys behind, which seemed like an even worse idea. My mind raced through scenarios, each one seeming riskier than the last. The longer he stayed, the more I felt like time was stretching out, amplifying every tiny detail. The way he leaned his weight on my car, the way his eyes flicked back toward the pumps, and the way he ignored every subtle cue I gave that I wasn't interested in talking. It was a silent kind of alarm. The realization that something was deeply wrong, but without any loud or obvious signs to confirm it. It was just me, standing there, trying to appear calm, while every instinct inside me screamed to run, but with nowhere to go. Just as I was grappling with the weight of the situation, scanning for any possible escape, my eyes landed on a man standing across the parking lot. He looked older, maybe in his late 40s or 50s, dressed casually in jeans and a jacket. He was standing near the entrance of the convenience store, holding a bag of what looked like snacks or a drink. I don't know what made me do it, but I locked eyes with him and tried with every ounce of energy to convey that something wasn't right. My gaze lingered, almost pleading, as if silently screaming for him to notice the unease written all over my face. At first, he hesitated. He seemed to realize that I was looking directly at him, but his expression shifted briefly into something like uncertainty. He glanced away, and I felt a wave of disappointment, assuming he was just going to ignore me and walk inside. It felt like I had been left entirely on my own, and that realization made the situation feel even more desperate. But then, just a minute later, I saw him emerge from the store again, now holding 2 sodas. I barely had time to process it before he started walking directly toward me. My heart jumped, half in relief and half in fear. Relief that someone was coming over, and fear that it might escalate things with the man who was already making me so uncomfortable. The older man approached with a calm, steady stride, as if he had done this 100 times before. He didn't acknowledge the other man at first. Instead, he turned his attention straight to me, and in a loud, cheerful voice, said something like, "Hey, good thing you stopped here. Your mom's been hinting about being thirsty for the last half hour. I got you a soda too while I was in. Do you know how to get to some town name, or should we just follow each other?" For a second, I was too startled to respond, but then it clicked. He was pretending to know me. His tone was casual, but his words were deliberate. He wasn't asking me if I needed help outright, but he gave me a lifeline to grab onto without making it obvious to the other man what he was doing. I played along, nodding quickly and responding with something like, "Oh, I'd better follow you. You know how bad I am with directions." My voice sounded shaky to me, but I hoped it wasn't noticeable. He smiled warmly, handed me one of the sodas, and motioned toward his car parked near the entrance of the lot. What struck me in that moment was how carefully he balanced the interaction. He didn't confront the other man directly or make any accusations, which could have escalated things. Instead, he created a scenario where I could leave the situation without making it look like an escape. It was as if he knew the exact dynamics of what was happening and how to diffuse it without tipping anyone off. The other man's reaction was subtle but telling. He straightened up and stepped back slightly, his posture stiffening as he watched the older man interact with me. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the tension shift. The older man had changed the dynamic just enough to make it clear I wasn't alone anymore, that someone was watching. It was such a small act, but it felt monumental in that moment, like a lifeline pulling me out of deep water. As I followed the older man's lead and walked toward my car, I could feel the creepy man's eyes on me. I avoided looking back, afraid of what I might see, but I could tell he wasn't going to follow. The stranger's calm presence had disrupted whatever plan the man might have had, and for the first time in several minutes, I felt a flicker of hope. After the older man gave me the soda and helped me leave the situation, I followed his car out of the gas station. My hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing with a mix of relief and lingering fear. He drove slowly, deliberately, as if to give me time to process what had just happened. I stayed close behind him, almost afraid to lose sight of his taillights, even though we were now safely on the road. After a few miles, he signaled to turn down a different street. He slowed enough to wave a simple, "You're good now" gesture out the window before driving away. I pulled over a short distance later to collect myself, my chest still tight with residual anxiety. It wasn't until I was back at my dorm that the weight of what had happened fully hit me. I replayed every moment, the man leaning on my car, his glances toward the pumps, the feeling of being cornered, and then the older man stepping in at just the right time. It struck me how easily the situation could have gone another way. The older man didn't know me, but he trusted his instincts enough to act. That small decision to step in felt enormous now. He didn't confront anyone, didn't make a scene, but he created an out for me when I couldn't see one for myself. I wished I could have thanked him properly. His calm intervention not only diffused the immediate danger, but also left me with a profound sense of gratitude. I couldn't stop thinking about how he recognized the silent alarm in my expression and acted on it, even though he could have easily ignored it, as so many others might have. It made me realize how crucial those small, decisive moments can be. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking about that day often, wondering if I would have the courage to do the same for someone else. The truth was, before this, I might not have. It's easy to assume someone else will step in or to hesitate, afraid of misreading the situation or looking foolish. But now, I knew how much it could mean to someone. That man's simple actions had saved me from something I didn't even want to imagine, and I knew I couldn't forget that. Since then, I've had 2 opportunities to step in and help others in similar situations. In both cases, it involved women who were clearly uncomfortable around men who were being overly persistent. Once, it was at a bar where I pretended to be the best friend of a woman who looked cornered by someone too pushy. Another time, it was at a bus station. where a woman seemed overwhelmed by a man pressing her for conversation. In both cases, I used the same tactic, approaching with a friendly familiarity, offering an escape without escalating it. In high school, the basement became my escape. As the oldest of 4 siblings, I craved privacy, and the basement, though unfinished and a bit drafty, offered that sanctuary. My parents had set up a makeshift room for me with a bed, a small desk, and some shelves for my books. The walls were partially drywalled, but the exposed beams and occasional spider webs reminded me that this wasn't a fully livable space. The house itself was relatively new, but the basement had an atmosphere all its own, darker, quieter, and oddly detached from the rest of the home. Over time, I became accustomed to the sounds of the house. The groaning of the water heater in the laundry corner became background noise, as did the occasional shuffle of feet from my siblings upstairs. The layout of the house meant I could often tell exactly who was walking where based on their footsteps. My mom's hurried pace in the kitchen sounded different from my dad's slower, deliberate steps, and I could easily recognize the thundering sprints of my younger siblings. But there was one sound that started to puzzle me: footsteps late at night, long after everyone else had gone to bed. The noises always began the same way. Just as I'd start to drift off, I'd hear the distinct sound of someone coming down the main staircase in the center of the house. The rhythm was too deliberate to be creaks from the house settling, heavy steps descending one by one. They were slow, as if the person was being cautious. Then the footsteps would continue across the kitchen floor, which sat directly above my room. The pattern was consistent, each step muffled by the thick flooring, but unmistakable in its regularity. It was clear someone was walking, yet when I climbed upstairs to investigate, the house was always still. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was one of my parents getting a late-night snack or checking on the house. I didn't even mention it to them the next morning. But as the nights went on, the pattern repeated. The footsteps never varied in their path. Staircase to kitchen, then silence. I started timing them. It seemed they always happened between midnight and 1 a.m., long after everyone had gone to bed. On particularly restless nights, I'd sit up in bed waiting for them, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if watching would somehow reveal the source of the sound. When I finally decided to check upstairs more thoroughly, the results only deepened my unease. The first floor lights were always off, the doors locked, and the kitchen completely undisturbed. Once, I tiptoed up to the second floor, my heart pounding as I checked each bedroom. My parents and siblings were all fast asleep. Their steady breathing filled the rooms, a stark contrast to the eerie stillness I just left behind. I stood in the hallway for a moment, straining to hear anything else, but the house remained silent. Even in the daylight, I found myself replaying the events in my mind, trying to find a logical explanation. Could it have been the wind? A neighbor's pet? But nothing made sense. The footsteps were so clear, so intentional, that dismissing them as random noises felt like a lie. Over time, I stopped sharing my suspicions with myself, let alone anyone else. The basement had been my refuge, but now, as I lay in bed each night listening for those sounds, it felt like I wasn't the only one down there. Years later, as our family prepared to move for my dad's job, the house was emptied. All the furniture, boxes, and remnants of our lives were loaded onto a moving truck. The basement that had once been my sanctuary was stripped of its makeshift charm, reduced to bare walls and the dull concrete floor. The emptiness made it even eerier than I remembered, as every small noise now echoed through the cavernous space. My friends and I thought it would be fun, one last adventure, to camp out in the house before we officially left. It was meant to be a nostalgic send-off, but it became something else entirely. We set up sleeping bags and pillows in the basement, illuminated by a single flashlight and the faint glow of a lantern. The house felt cavernous and foreign without its usual furnishings. It was as if the walls had grown taller, the shadows deeper. We joked about the stories I'd shared with them, recounting the strange footsteps and sounds from years prior. My friends were skeptical, laughing it off as an overactive imagination or the natural creaks of an aging house. Despite their dismissals, a part of me was uneasy, like the house itself was listening. As the night wore on, the laughter faded, replaced by the awkward silences that only come when everyone realizes they're thinking the same thing, but are too nervous to say it. Around midnight, the first sound came, a faint, deliberate creak from the main floor above us. My heart skipped, and I saw my friends exchange uncertain glances. One of them whispered, "That was just the wind, right?" But his voice lacked conviction. We all knew it wasn't the wind. The house was sealed tight, and the night outside was calm. Minutes later, we heard it again. This time, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They moved slowly, methodically, from one end of the main floor to the other. Each step was heavy, deliberate, and eerily familiar to me. My friends, now visibly unnerved, huddled closer to the small pool of light cast by the lantern. One of them suggested it might be a squatter or a neighbor playing a prank, but none of us were brave enough to check. We simply sat there, frozen. As the footsteps continued, the sounds escalated. What started as slow, measured steps became hurried, almost frantic, as if someone or something was running back and forth across the house. Then they moved to the staircase. We heard each creak of the wooden steps as they descended. By now, my friends weren't laughing or trying to rationalize. The fear in their eyes mirrored my own. One of them grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the staircase, but the beam revealed nothing. The stairs were empty, yet the sound persisted. The final straw came when the basement door, one that had been shut and locked earlier, creaked open. We all froze, holding our breaths as the door swung wider, revealing nothing but darkness. It was as if the house itself was daring us to stay. That was when we decided we'd had enough. Grabbing our things, we bolted out of the basement, our footsteps echoing as we scrambled up the stairs and out the front door. The cold night air hit us like a slap, but it was a relief to be outside, away from whatever had been inside. We didn't stop running until we reached my friend's car, parked at the end of the driveway. None of us spoke as we sped away, leaving the house behind. Even now, I can't explain what we heard that night. It was as though the house had been waiting for us to leave, and on that final night, it wanted to make its presence known. Years later, during a casual family gathering, our old house came up in conversation. We were reminiscing about the quirky layout and fond memories, but it didn't take long for the tone to shift. My younger sister was the first to bring it up. Without hesitation, she casually mentioned how she always thought that house was haunted. Her words immediately grabbed everyone's attention. The room fell silent for a moment before my younger brother chimed in, echoing her sentiment. "I used to hear footsteps all the time when I was alone," he admitted, his voice tinged with unease. Their stories began to flow, and each revelation made my skin crawl. My sister described how, even as a teenager, she avoided being alone in the house for too long. She recounted evenings spent studying in her room, only to pause in confusion as she heard what sounded like someone walking up and down the hallway outside her door. Every time she mustered the courage to check, the hallway was empty. She had convinced herself it was just the house settling in her imagination. But hearing my brother confirm similar experiences made her doubt that explanation. My brother's stories were even more specific. He recalled lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, and hearing the distinct creak of floorboards in the hallway. It wasn't random creaks, he clarified. It sounded like footsteps, like someone pacing. On 2 separate occasions, he had even heard the sound of his bedroom door creaking open. Expecting it to be our dad checking on him, he had sat up and called out, only to find the door slightly ajar with no one there. "I even yelled for Dad once," he admitted, looking toward my father. My dad, to everyone's surprise, nodded in agreement. "You did," he confirmed. "I remember coming upstairs to see what was wrong, but there was nothing." Hearing this, I couldn't help but think back to my own experiences in the basement. Those footsteps I heard so often, footsteps I could never trace, suddenly didn't feel like a figment of my imagination. It was eerie to realize that none of us had ever talked about these things while we lived there. We had all brushed them off, too embarrassed or unsure to share. But now, years later, the stories painted a disturbing picture. Even my dad, who was always the skeptical, grounded one, confessed that he had sometimes heard strange noises in the house. He had always chalked it up to the quirks of an older home, but hearing all of us recount similar experiences made him pause. "I always thought I'd walk in and catch one of you sneaking around," he admitted with a nervous chuckle, "but I never did." By the end of the conversation, the room was filled with an unspoken tension. It was unsettling to think about how many strange occurrences we had all experienced separately yet collectively. And while none of us claimed to understand or explain what had happened in that house, one thing was clear: none of us would be eager to step back inside. When I was around 12, my family moved into a house that was both exciting and strange. It wasn't new by any means. In fact, it had clearly seen many years of use. But to us, it was an upgrade. It was a larger, more comfortable space compared to our previous home, and it offered us more room to spread out. The house sat on a quiet lane in our village, surrounded by mature trees, with a slightly overgrown garden that seemed as though it had been left unattended for some time. It had a charm to it, but it also felt oddly empty, as though it were waiting for someone to fill it again. The layout was somewhat unique. Part of the house had previously been a bungalow before renovations added a second story. My sister and I ended up in the ground floor bedrooms, which were at the end of a long, straight hallway. Our rooms were next to each other, separated by a single wall. The hallway itself stretched past a guest suite at one end and led back toward the living room and kitchen on the other side of the house. The floors were polished walnut, and the smooth, cold wood stretched throughout the ground floor, except for the Persian rug that had been placed strategically in the hallway to break up the expanse of wood. The rug lay directly outside my room, a simple comfort meant to avoid the chill of bare feet meeting hardwood in the mornings. It didn't take long for the house to establish its own character. From the very beginning, it had an atmosphere that was hard to define, quiet but heavy, as though the air carried a weight that was just enough to notice, but not enough to question. It wasn't immediately unsettling, but it was present. That sense of something just slightly out of the ordinary became more apparent in the evenings, especially when the house settled into silence. At first, I thought it was just the creaks and groans of an old house adjusting to its new occupants, but it soon became clear there was a pattern to the sounds. Every night, at almost exactly the same time, around 11 p.m., I would hear footsteps in the hallway. They always started at the far end, near the guest suite, and slowly made their way down toward my sister's room and mine. The sound was unmistakable, a deliberate, steady pace of what I could only describe as someone walking in hard-soled shoes. There was a sharpness to the noise that cut through the stillness, and no matter how many times I heard it, it made me pause. I knew the sounds of my family well. The way my dad's steps were heavier, the lighter, quicker rhythm of my mom's movements, or even the shuffling of my sister. This wasn't them. The first few times, I thought perhaps one of my parents had forgotten something and had come downstairs. But each time I would realize that wasn't possible. Everyone else was already in bed. The footsteps didn't match anyone in the house, and even stranger, they sounded like someone wearing outdoor shoes. In our home, we always wore slippers or socks inside. The idea that someone would be walking the halls at night in shoes made the sound even more out of place. What struck me most was the consistency of the sound. The steps would move at the same pace every time, starting at the far end of the hallway and making their way toward me. It was always deliberate, never rushed. The familiarity of the pattern somehow made it even more unnerving. It wasn't random creaks or noises that could be dismissed. It was a routine. And the fact that the house felt so still during the day only amplified how vivid and real these nighttime sounds were. The footsteps became something I couldn't ignore. They were too distinct, too deliberate, and most of all, too consistent. Every night, without fail, the pattern would repeat. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing the sound was coming. It would start faintly at the far end of the hallway, near the guest suite, a slow, measured rhythm of someone walking with purpose. As the sound grew closer, it was impossible to dismiss it as creaking floorboards or the usual noises an old house makes. It was unmistakably footsteps. What made it even more eerie was how clearly I could distinguish the break in the sound when the steps reached the Persian rug outside my room. The footsteps would abruptly pause, as though the walker were crossing the rug. The soft, muffled silence would last just long enough to cover the distance of the rug, 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then the footsteps would resume on the wooden floor on the other side, louder and clearer as they moved past my door toward the living room. It was a small detail, but it made the whole thing feel even more real. The pause wasn't random. It aligned perfectly with the layout of the hallway, as if whoever or whatever it was knew exactly where the rug began and ended. There was a strange calm to the way it moved, as though it had no urgency, no reason to rush. Yet that calmness didn't feel comforting. Instead, it left me with a low, gnawing unease. I would lie frozen in my bed, too afraid to move or even look toward the door. The sound wasn't accompanied by any creaks of doors opening or closing, no shuffling or additional noises, just the steady progression of those footsteps. At first, I tried rationalizing it. Maybe it was the acoustics of the house amplifying noises from somewhere else. Perhaps someone in the family was awake but didn't want to admit to wandering the halls late at night. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The footsteps didn't match anyone in the family. My sister was too light-footed, my parents moved differently, and no one would be wearing hard-soled shoes indoors. And even if they were, why would they be walking the exact same route every night, stopping at the same points? Despite the growing unease, I couldn't bring myself to investigate. I would simply lie there, stiff and silent, waiting for the footsteps to fade away. I didn't dare open my door, and I certainly never stepped into the hallway to see what or who might be there. It wasn't fear of a person or even something supernatural. It was the kind of dread that came from the unknown. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to harm me, but it also wasn't something I wanted to face. It felt like a presence, something that had its own routine, its own existence, and I didn't want to disrupt it or draw its attention. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started. About 3 or 4 weeks after we moved in, they simply ceased. One night I stayed awake far longer than I should have, expecting the familiar rhythm to begin, waiting for the telltale pause at the Persian rug. But the house was unnervingly silent. At first, I thought I might have just missed it. Perhaps I had dozed off without realizing it, so I stayed up again the next night, and the next. But night after night, there was nothing. No footsteps, no pauses, no soft creaks on the wood, just silence. The absence of the sound was almost as unsettling as its presence had been. It felt like something had left, but I couldn't tell why, or even what. I kept expecting it to return, kept bracing myself every night for that faint sound in the distance, but it never came back. Even as time went on, I couldn't quite shake the unease the memory left behind. It wasn't just the footsteps themselves that lingered, it was the lack of explanation. Why had it started in the first place? Why had it stopped? What had changed? I tried asking my parents and sister if they had noticed anything strange during those weeks, but no one seemed to share the experience. My sister, whose room was just across the hall from mine, claimed she never heard anything. My parents chalked it up to my imagination or old house noises. Their dismissiveness made me doubt myself for a time, but deep down I knew the sound was real. It wasn't the kind of thing you forget. Years later, when I thought back to it as an adult, the experience took on a new weight. At the time, I had brushed it off as something strange but harmless, a quirk of the old house or my own overactive imagination. But now, the idea that there could have been something, or someone, making those footsteps gnawed at me. The memory of the sound, the distinct pause at the rug, the eerie precision of it all, remained vivid. Even though the footsteps never returned, their absence didn't bring the comfort I hoped for. Instead, it left an open question, a blank space where the answer should have been. The house, though quieter, never quite felt the same. It wasn't threatening or overtly scary. It just carried a faint, unshakable weight, as if the echoes of those footsteps were still hidden somewhere in the walls, waiting for the right moment to return.